there's a lot of different layers when we're talking about classification of organisms. So we center our study of classification of organism around 3 different disciplines, which is systematics, phylogeny, and taxonomy. So let's define some of these terms here. So systematics, this is the area of study that organisms are classified, or when we mean classified, grouped based on the way they evolved over time. Evolution is the basis for when we're talking about classification, systematics, phylogeny, biodiversity. We can look back at our evidence for evolution and use a lot of these to classify organisms. So we can look at just phenotypes. How does something look? They used to rely on this a lot, as well as behaviors, maybe some things we knew about physiology, fossil records. But what has really changed our game in modern times in terms of classifying organisms is the ability to use biotechnology, bioengineering, looking at molecular level stuff like DNA, RNA, amino acids, and proteins, as well as how do immune systems function. So in this kind of modern age, we go from using these more superficial classifications to more concrete. Very much like that order we went in and talking about the evidence for evolution. Taxonomy, this is also kind of like a part of overall systematics, but in this case, what we are doing was we're using like a language. We're naming things. We're using different word groups to group things together. So systematics is the actual like grouping, and taxonomy is the naming part of it. Then we're going to take the grouping with the names and we're going to put them in a visual plan, which we call phylogeny. So phylogeny makes these, often we look at trees. When we talked about the history of human evolution, we ended looking at a phylogenetic tree of the humans. We saw with humans how ancestries were shared. We're talking about the common ancestors here. We'll observe a number of different phylogenetic trees, but I want to go back just, if you flip back to the previous page in your notebook, and you take a look at this. This is a phylogenetic tree of humans. And this one is kind of sideways. A lot of times they do it this way, so this looks more like the trunk of the tree. And what we're seeing here is that combination of systematics, a system for grouping all of the different human species in one place. And then we're looking at the taxon. We can see the different names of all of the human ancestors. And then we put them on a graphic model to show their evolutionary relationships, where there are common ancestries, and we get this visual tree, the phylogenetic tree of human life. So, for example, if we take a look at Australopithecus afarensis, what this is showing us is that there is a common ancestor between the whole Homo genus branch of the tree and the Australopithecus branch of the tree. So a phylogenetic tree, as you just saw there, and I've got one on your page and up here in the corners. We'll look at this a lot more soon enough. This one is used to show all organisms in one place. We can make our phylogenetic trees very, very specific, like we did with the human ancestors. This one is very, very general. It includes all living things. So our phylogenetic trees, again, remember what they are highlighting is those evolutionary relationships amongst organisms. And again, it could be really, really specific, just talking about a group of organisms like humans, or we can do it really, really general and show all of life. So there's a lot of different ways to use these taxonomic trees, but the main thing is just to show you're expressing the common ancestry of the evolutionary relationships among different groups or taxon. When we're looking at these groups, we call them clades. So this word clade is just a more scientific name for saying group. So like the Homo genus, that's a clade of humans. The Australopithecus genus, a clade of other humans. Carol Linnaeus, Carl von Linné, or Carolus Linnaeus goes by a bunch of different names, and perhaps because he had a lot of different names in different social circles and professional circles, he created this taxonomic classification system. And when we take a look at this idea, I'm going to skip ahead to here. This idea is just makes the world more organized in terms of organisms and their evolutionary relationships with some kind of common ancestor where they branch from. So perhaps Carolus went to the store, and he went to a store that was really disorganized, and he thought, this could have a better organization system. So like, for example, if you go to like Target and you walk in the door, if the way Target ran its store, if they were like, okay, whenever a truck comes in, we're just gonna unload that truck and we're gonna put all the stuff on any empty shelf. And nothing would ever have a system, nothing would ever be in the same place. They're just like unload and shove things on shelves. When you walked into Target, you'd be like, oh no, this is gonna take me so long to walk all the aisles to find the 5 items I need. But really, when you walk into Target, you can walk in and you can look up at the ceiling and it'll say things like clothing and pharmacy, food. And so it has all the larger categories labeled up on the ceiling. So you can head toward, you're going to the pharmacy section if you want to get Band-Aids, and you walk over in that direction, and then as you get closer at the end of the aisles, it'll have like general things, like first aid might be one of the aisles. And so you look at all the different aisle names and you're like, okay, I gotta go to the first aid aisle. And then you go down the first aid aisle and there's little signs that are sticking out and they say what's in the first aid aisle. And so then you're looking for Band-Aids. And so then you go to that Band-Aid area, and then within that, they might have other classifications. And so classification in general, the way that we work best as humans is for things to be organized. And so Carlos here was like, yeah, let's do that for living things. Let's make sure that there's a universal language that everybody understands and speaks when it comes to organisms. So the clade system, we go from really, really general, and then we get very, very eventually specific. So they go like this. So you have 3 domains, and then some of the domains will have kingdoms, and then you have phylums, and you have class, families, orders. We haven't gotten here, or sorry, class, order, family, and then we have gotten into a little bit of genus, right? When we're talking about like the Homo genus or the Australopithecus genus. And then we get into very much looking at evolutionary relationships when we get to the species level. I like that they use the term species because that means specific, that this group specifically can only mate with others of the same group. They are isolated from all of the other taxon. They can only potentially interbreed with themselves, meaning that when you are a species group, you have isolation from other groups, because in your group you can have offspring who are fertile and have offspring, but if you try to mate with a different species or specific group and you try and mate, if you have offspring and your offspring are not fertile, it means you're not the same group or species. There is tons of work here. There is a lot of sorting. As scientists in the world start to be able to run the genomes of different organisms, and there are still so many organisms that their full genomes or all of their DNA is not even mapped out yet. But as scientists go through different groups, they start to compare pieces of either, again, the DNA, the RNA, amino acid sequences of proteins, and they go, oh, we actually thought this group belonged over here, but now we're going to put it over here. And so a lot of this is changing. I have seen, just like in the last about 15 years, there used to be a kingdom under the Eukarya domain. We belong to the Eukarya domain. When you hear the word Eukarya, it refers to eukaryotic cells. And so all of our cells in our body, with the exception, we'll talk about one that doesn't have a nucleus, but we are characteristically, we have cells that have a nucleus. And about 15 years ago, there were only 4 kingdoms under Eukarya. There was Animalia, Plantae, Fungi, and Protista. And then the Protista, they started going like, wait, protists are very, very, very broad and what they are. Somebody lumped all of these smaller organisms generally into one group. And they started to go, you know what, I actually think there's so much diversity in that Protista kingdom that we should start to chop this up into many kingdoms. And so what you have seen happening, or what I have seen happening in the last 15 years, is starting to rewrite that one kingdom into different kingdoms. And I think just watching the way these things change over time, that there are big conferences where people who study protists come together and then they talk about rearranging this. So this constantly has changed drastically in the last 15 years. So there's lots and lots of work out there. If it's something that you're like, oh, I think that's kind of cool to like look at the genomics, that's a whole exploding field. Look at the genes, the DNA of organisms, and then compare them, and then use that information in certain ways. Like if you were somebody who's interested in like immunology, but you're also like, this sounds pretty cool, you could start working in genomics to see groups of organisms that might have, for example, antibiotic resistance, and go into the pharmaceutical area of creating new antibiotics based on the genomics of different organisms. So there's just so many, instead of just thinking like, oh, I'm gonna go and like sequence DNA, you can apply those sequencing efforts into a lot of different areas: biomedical, environmental. Can this group of organisms start to break down toxic chemicals into compounds that are less toxic? So there's just a lot of ideas out there. Okay, so this is one of my favorite animals ever. This is called Chilenius undulatus. I love this fish for a number of reasons. Let me give you a little bit of the natural history. This fish lives on the other side of the world in the Indo-Pacific. It's in a group, a taxon called the wrasses, and the wrasse, so let me just point out a couple things. Blue is my favorite color, and this fish has like a neon blue skin with neon green, cool pattern running through it. It has, it's about this big. It has a really big head with this big hump on it. And it's got these big lips, and it has usually like a couple teeth here and there sticking up. So it looks kind of, I don't know, kind of like dopey, happy. And as I said, it belongs to the group of wrasses. The wrasses, they do this really wild thing. They have the ability to change their sex over time. So this is what we call in a population the supermale. There's generally one supermale in a whole population. So like, for example, let's say Moraine Valley. We look at the Moraine Valley population, and if there was one supermale amongst the whole Moraine Valley population. So this is a really special fish. This fish, all the females are like, I want to mate with that fish. I want their genes in my offspring. I want to have my offspring have the potential to be that one special supermale in the population. So the supermale, a lot of females are trying to mate with this male. The other males are kind of like this size, and they're very drab, not bright colored like this. And so the other males are trying to do all kinds of dances and show, I can protect your babies, and they're trying to get the female's attention, but yet the females are like, I want to mate with this supermale. So there's some interesting behaviors that happen amongst the grasses in a population of Chileneus undulatus. When the Chileneus undulatus is about to die, when it's sick and old or whatever, maybe it gets a virus, whatever's happening and it's going to die, it starts to give off, they believe, these chemicals. We often refer to them as pheromones. And in the water, these pheromones are sent out. Now, what happens is that some of the really larger, dominant females in the population, their bodies start to react over these pheromones that the supermale is giving off. And then there's some fighting of who has the most dominant genes and et cetera. And eventually it comes down to one female in the population. She starts to change up her internal physiology and anatomy, and she starts to have a more dominant male reproductive system. She starts to grow in size, her colors start to change, and she transforms into the new supermale. Isn't that cool? It's like wild, right? Imagine your life, that you're just going about your life and you're very popular in your community, and all of a sudden your physiology starts to totally change and you become something completely different, and your role in your society has completely changed. So I just think it's fascinating. I was doing some research in the Philippines a long time ago, and I came up from the dive, and I was so excited because there's only one in the population. So when you go to an area like the Philippines and you go on a reef, and you'll see the other, like juvenile, or the other males that are not brightly colored, and the females, and you're like, okay, oh man, I see those little humphead wrasse, but I really want to see the supermale. It's really kind of amazing when you see the supermale, because it's not always around when you're around. So I come up and I'm like, oh my gosh, did you all see the humphead wrasse? And then somebody else says, oh, did you all see the Napoleon wrasse? And then someone else said, I saw an Ipus ipus. And then someone else said, I saw the double-headed Maori wrasse. And then we get to talking, and I'm like, oh, we're all talking about Chileneus undulatus. And had we just used the same scientific name, we immediately would have realized after a 20-minute conversation of being so excited to see this one kind of fish that we have been talking about the same thing. So that's why it's really important in science to condense everything to one language.
Was this like the name of the whole species, or just the supermale?
The whole species, yeah. So just like, it'd be like if Chileneus undulatus were like Homo sapiens, and there was only one like super Homo sapien in the population. Yeah, so it's just one of the whole group.
So did you see like the super?
Yeah.
Oh, you
So we utilize in science taxonomy, and then we get down to the specifics, the species of the scientific name. They call it the binomial system of nomenclature. Bi means two, and then you have nomenclature name. It's a two-name system of naming organisms. And like I said, Carolus Linnaeus, Carl von Linné, Carl, whatever he wants to go by, maybe having all these different names in different groups inspired him to make the scientific name. The scientific name, this binomial, is a genus name and a species name. So those last two taxon groups start to get very specific. And just like us in the Homo genus, there were different species of humans in the Homo genus, but we're only the one specific kind being Homo sapiens. We are reproductively isolated from all the other ones, or we were, I should say. So let's take a look at some scientific names. When we look at Chelinius undulatus, Chelinius is the genus name and undulatus is the species name. I have a couple other ones listed, like Chelonius midas is the green sea turtle, Calicebus malik is the red titi monkey, Cardinalis, that red bird we see in our area, is the northern red cardinal. And then you worked with Escherichia coli. Because E. coli is it's a common bacteria that humans have interactions with, they were like, oh my gosh, to write out this whole genus name all the time. We just call it E. coli, but just note, the E period refers to Escherichia, the genus name. One of the things I want you to notice about all of these scientific names that I have up here is that they're all written in italics. So when you're typing a scientific name, you always put it in italics. And that notes that, hey, this is a universal name for this organism or this species. The other thing is that in that two-name system, you'll notice, like for example, these two, that both or all of the genus names are capitalized, but the species names are not. So we just have a little bit of rules about how we write these taxon or these names. So again, the genus name is always capitalized and the species name is in lowercase. If you're typing, you put it in italics. So like when I was doing my research, I had a book, and then when I got on the boat, I would start writing out what I saw and behaviors and just notes about what I observed. And so then if I was writing out Chelinius undulatus, because I don't really have the ability to write in italics, I would underline those scientific names. So let's take a look at this question. I want you to pick out which of these is correct. And not necessarily like knowing the name and the spelling. What I want you to look at is the italics and the specifics we just talked about of the genus and species names and the way they are noted up here. So which one is correct? Which one? Yeah, okay. So C is written correctly. Let's just take a look at each of these. Homo sapiens, this is not italics, and the sapiens should be lowercase. Trichechus manatus, this should be a trichechus, it should be a capital T. Otherwise, it's fine. We've got the genus name capitalized, species name lowercase, and it is in italics. This one's underlined, genus name capitalized, species name also capitalized. This should not be capitalized. And then here we have italics. We've got the species name in lowercase, but the genus name should be capitalized. All right, a little bit about biodiversity and the application of thinking about systematics in terms of biodiversity. That oftentimes when people talk about biodiversity, and the term bio means living, and then diversity, the amount we often think about. But one of the things about biodiversity is that there's an underlying force in biodiversity which says that living things cannot exist alone. Can you survive as a species without interacting with any other species? Could you survive? Okay, so just thinking about one of the characteristics of life, one of the main ones that drives all the other ones, is that living things need and acquire energy. And so just your food source, right? You get your food from different species. So if we took away that interaction, we wouldn't be able to eat. We wouldn't be able to breathe. We wouldn't get our oxygen either. So just like those obvious things of eating, yeah, we rely on other species for our survival. So this kind of like underlying current of biodiversity is not only just the amount of species, but the idea of biodiversity is super complex in that organisms do not exist in isolation. They exist with the interaction of other species. And so that if we're looking at an ecosystem that's super biodiverse, what that means is that you have great interactions amongst all of the species. If you look at an ecosystem and the biodiversity starts to go down, what ecologists will do is they'll start going, what's missing? What species has been affected that has caused a chain effect on the rest of the species? So like the dinosaurs, for example, when that meteorite crashes and it stirs up all that dust, the first group of organisms that are hurt are the plants. So food for all the other organisms is affected. Once the food starts to be minimized and start to die off, the herbivores start to die off. The omnivores, who eat both the herbivores as well as the plants, start to die off. And then you have the carnivores, who eat meat, and they start to die off. So looking at that mass extinction event, the effect of all of the plants has a chain effect on everything else. And so it's not always as... So let's talk about what's out there in terms of numbers. So the estimated biodiversity, I think this is interesting. So about somewhere 7,000 to 10,000 species are discovered every year. And they can be discovered like bacterial-wise or archaea-wise in a lab maybe. They could be discovered out on the earth. Most of them are insects, people that are doing studies in the rainforest. That's most of the species. The insect group of animals is enormous. There's about maybe 1.5, 2 million species that are identified, and how many are actually out there? Well, who knows, but it can be believed from 1 million more to 10 million, hundreds of millions. We're not exactly sure. So let's talk about who's identified. Of our 3 domain groups, there's bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Prokaryotes, which consist of 2 of the domains, the bacterial domain and the archaea domain. So 2 of our 3 domains are very likely the vast majority of species on the earth. Yet, only 5% of them, in addition to this eukaryote group, the protists, who are also really, really big in terms of the eukaryans, these are smaller creatures, smaller organisms, I should say. And there's only 5% of them that are identified. Plants and fungus, about 22% identified, and the rest are animals. So, you have like 70 plus some animalia that are identified in terms of all the identified species. Let me ask you this. So on your phone or your tablet or computer, do any of you have a bacterium or bacteria on your phone wallpaper? And every day when you look at your phone, the first thing you see is those bacteria, and you're like, I love you, E. coli. You're just the cutest. And every day it makes you happy to see the bacteria as your wallpaper. Anybody? Okay, so how many of you have some kind of animal, like a human or humans or other kind of animal? Anybody? So let me ask this. Anybody have something that is either a protist, a plant, or a fungus? Anybody? I know mushrooms are kind of cool right now. Okay, so all of you, I'm gonna guess, then have some kind of animal, human animal, or maybe a pet, or some other funny animal that's out there. As humans, because we are animals, and one of the things about animals that's very common is that animals have like eyes and nose and mouth and ears, and so when we see an animal, we see that similarity to us, and we just have this instinct because of our instincts for reproduction and having that attraction of things that look like us, like other humans who look like us. We see other animals, we're like, oh, they kind of look like us. That's cute, or that's ugly cute. It's so ugly, it's cute, right? And so we are very attracted in terms of our instincts to think something is cute or cool. Whereas looking at the plates of E. coli, right? When we plated out the E. coli, were you like, that is so cute? Any of you think that when you were looking at the plate, that you were like, so cute, oh my gosh, let me take a picture, share with my friends, right? We just don't think those are cute, because they just don't have like the little face. And scientists in general, they like to study things that you're like instinctually appreciate. And so that's why animals are mostly identified. The other thing is that it's a lot easier to study an animal than it is to study prokaryotes. So I'll tell you in a few weeks about, I teach a class in the summer where I take students to Belize to study marine biology. And all of my students do a research project when they're there. And sometimes I get a student who's really interested in microbiology, and they're like, I want to do this study, I want to do a research project. And so we got to talking about it. And just like what we did in the lab, for example, you had to swab plates, right? Then you had to stick them in an incubator, and then you take them out. And we looked at just kind of the general populations of E. coli. But if we wanted to start to look at them as more like individual unicellular organisms, we'd take some of that, and then we would make a slide, and we'd probably stain that slide. And these processes are they can be quite long. You have to work in very sterile conditions. And then you have to use a microscope, and you have to like spend a lot of time identifying things under the microscope. And so one of the things about like going to a foreign country or just plane travel in general is that they don't like you carrying bacteria on the plane, and especially going from one country to another. They're like, you can't bring other species from our country into your country. And that protects us, and we'll talk a little bit about like invasive species as we get toward the end of the semester, and it controls like what can go out of control in other countries. So anyway, like a lot of times when I have students who are like, I want to do this bacterial project, blah, blah, and I'm like, oh, we have huge limitations on doing that. And so if you're somebody who's like, I want to go to this other country and I want to study the microbiome of the rainforest, it can be very complicated to bring your results back home. You might actually have to go and set up a lab there to do your studies. So when you're studying some of these smaller organisms, the means of studying them can get very, very complicated. Whereas most of my students are studying animals. Occasionally I get one or two that are going to study a protist like algae. And so we can just like do our observations and write down our data there and take lots of video and pictures and then bring it back, and we can do our analysis, some there and some back at home. It's a lot easier to do. So that's why mostly animals are identified. But if you're interested in, let's say, like plants and their different abilities, or fungus as well, there's a lot of biomedical research going on right now in the world of fungi to treat some of the toxins that fungus make to treat mental health issues. So there's a lot of really exciting things that are going on here. Or if you're really interested in like antibiotic resistance research, there's a lot of interesting things going on in this world as well. Or if you're interested in like algae for the purposes of biofuel, there's so many things that you can study. And so these, while there's so much amazingness going on, there are limitations to them. But definitely if like I'm saying things and they're going like, oh, that sounds kind of cool, investigate that stuff. Right here in our backyards, we have the U of I, we have U of I Chicago and the U of I down in Champaign, sorry. But they have some really interesting like bioengineering programs and research going on there. So again, these are very attainable ways that you can do this kind of research and get that support. All right, so let's go back to this. So here we have a phylogenetic tree. This is a really, really general phylogenetic tree. What we are seeing at the top of our taxon is we are showing the 3 domains and how we have a relationship amongst them. And kind of the other thing interesting in terms of what we just looked at and species identification is that the 3 in all caps, those are domain level taxon. There's only 3 of them. Every organism is a bacteria, an archaea, or a eukarya. The next level down, it goes domain kingdom, There are no kingdoms identified in archaea or bacteria as of right now. The only kingdoms that are identified are in the eukarya. There's the animalia, the fungi, the plantae, and then we, as I mentioned before, the protista that used to be one kingdom, they're starting to like re-identify that. I believe there, as of right now, there's like 8 kingdoms that are named, and then there's other groups that they're like, where do these fit in all of this? So work on kingdom level taxon is happening over here in eukarya, but there needs to be a lot of work done here. So again, there's tons of work and research going on in the world there. Let's take a look. So what we're looking at in these is that every time you have the split of the tree, where a tree splits, you make branches. Where you have those splits to make new branches, those are indicators of a common ancestry between two groups. So it is believed that the first living thing may have been prokaryotic and unicellular. And we have 2 prokaryotic unicellular domains. So you can see they kind of merge them. It's hypothesized that it is probably an archaea, but again, we're still, nobody was there. So what you do see is that the bacteria and the archaea, the trunk of the tree branches off. And I have an arrow here that indicates that at this place where we have a branching that has occurred, there's a common ancestor between the bacteria and the archaea. The archaea group, we have a common ancestor here, us, we have a common ancestor with the archaea that makes our larger eukarya domain. And then if we follow this along to which kingdom we belong to Animalia, we're an animal, and we have a common ancestor with the fungi. So everywhere that you see that branching, it indicates that there's common ancestry between there, or there is a direct evolutionary relationship between different taxon or groups. So those 3 domains again, archaea. If you learned it as archaea, you can say it like that. I learned it as archaea. The archaeans, as I mentioned, they're prokaryotic. Remember, pro means no or before, karyotic means nucleus, so they evolved. If you think back to our clock of evolution, the Earth comes about, and then soon after, the prokaryotic cells evolve. They have no nucleus. Also, bacteria are prokaryotic. Both of these domains are unicellular, so we're talking about, I always think this is super amazing, that we have these one-celled organisms, and they have been alive for billions of years. So there's got to be some advantage to being super duper simple and tiny and just one cell as an organism. And then we look at larger organisms, organisms that have a nucleus. EU means true karyotic nucleus, so they have a nucleus. So remember, on our clock, even after about halfway through our clock, the eukarya start to develop or start to evolve. So the prokaryotes, the bacteria and archaea, have been around for like 2 billion years by themselves before you have mutations that give rise to membranes and eventually the nucleus. And just showing you that the only kingdoms that are named as of yet are underneath the eukarya. It is not to say these don't have kingdoms, but they're just not named yet. So I just want to show you a few different phylogenetic trees and different ways to utilize them. So here's a real general one. You saw very specific when we looked at the human one. And this is a eukarya phylogenetic tree. I'm going to show you a couple of those. One thing I want you to notice in terms of like biodiversity is that here's the animalia. Remember, the majority of organisms are this. Thinking about this tree, majority of organisms are here. But does it look like there's a lot more organisms in the rest of this tree? Yeah, right? So this is just a small portion of all of life. And even within the Eukarya, here's the Animalia, here's the fungi, here's the plantae, and then all the rest of those belong to the Protista kingdoms. So we'll focus on all of the different domains as we go through this unit. We're going to start with looking at different Eukarya groups or kingdoms. Eukarya are cells that, again, have a nucleus. Taxonomically, a lot of times students have a question: what's the difference between Eukarya, eukaryote, and eukaryotic? Eukarya is the domain name. When we're talking about eukaryote and then eukaryotic, eukaryote is a noun. This is a eukaryote. Animals are eukaryotes. If I want to use it as an adjective, I can say animals have eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic is an adjective for a noun. So eukaryote's a noun, eukaryotic is an adjective. They mean the same thing. Here's another, just of the eukaryotes, a different schematic of a phylogenetic tree. You can see lots of protist groups, the plantae, the fungi, and the animalia. So I like a question like this. What is the correct classification order from the largest to the least inclusive, meaning most specific? If you want to look back a few pages and go back to where I listed the taxonomy from the most general to the most specific, most inclusive to least inclusive. What's the most inclusive taxon? Domain, okay, good. So if we look at all of these, if you're like, wait, domain, this is the most inclusive, get rid of this. This is the least inclusive, so A we can get rid of. After domain, what comes next? Good, kingdom, okay. Okay, so these three are good, get rid of that one. After kingdom, what comes next? Phylum, okay, phylum, good, get rid of this. What comes next, class or order?
Class.
Yeah, good, class. Okay, so then we get rid of that. Some people do little, what are they called? Mnemonic devices, where you memorize like D, you memorize something that begins with a D, a K, a P, a C, an O, to memorize that. I don't know why, for me, I just always memorized it as domain, kingdom, class, order, family, genus, species. I don't know why that sticks in my head, but some people will do things like, I know one that's in a lot of textbook is something like dumb, king, Philip, can, blah, blah, blah. So you make up like a sentence that you can remember, and then each of those letters in the sentence represents each of these, and so if that helps you figure out a way. Okay, now let's talk about plant classification. This is going to help you with the lab today. So let's start with plants. I think that's next, right? Brought a bunch of plants in to show you, and that will help with the labs. Plants are super diverse. We often think of plants like this, right? Like flowering plants. If you thought about a plant, you might think about something like spider plant, pretty common in houses, very easy to grow. This is actually a great plant. A lot of your common house plants, like spider plants, are really great for cleaning your air, actually becoming air filters. One of the most toxic places on the planet is in your home. So having plants, if you can look up the best air filtering plants, go get a bunch of them, put them around. They often too, like a spider plant, they're really, really hard to kill if you're somebody who's like, I do not do well with plants. You just look up, like spider plants just need a little bit of light so they can go in almost any room. They are able to withstand a lot of temperatures, but that's one way. Every so often, really important to open your windows and let your house fully air out. So like, especially now, I love this time of year because we just open up all the windows. We keep them open all the time. I'm like, it's so nice. Anyway, so Let's talk about some of the key features of plants. One of the things we know about plants is that they undergo photosynthesis. This is probably the most common characteristic that we think of with plants, or you might think plants are green. Being green comes from the organelle, the chloroplast, and the chloroplast is the organelle that undergoes the process or metabolic pathway of photosynthesis. They are multicellular. We can see them with our eyeballs. We don't need a microscope to see them. And then they do this kind of funny thing. If you ever take a botany class, you'll see plants do all kinds of really crazy things that other species can't do. So let's talk about the impact of plants on other organisms. We need them. We just talked about before, right? That there are often chains effect. If plants are affected in an ecosystem because they use them for food, not only in the direct means of food, like we need to physically eat them, but also we need the oxygen that plants give off for us to undergo aerobic cell respiration, that we use our oxygen to help break down our food through that metabolic pathway that helps us to efficiently break down our big macro food molecules into those smaller micromolecules of energy, ATP. They also help clean the air, produce the air. They produce soil for growth of themselves, and also they help water to cycle. We'll talk about all of this through the course of the semester. Plants could also help to fight climate change, but the way that our food systems are often managed, they are managed to allow companies to do what are called monocultures. And if you've heard terms like, oh my gosh, the rainforests are being torn down like 88 football fields every second in the world, what that's doing is it's taking a very biodiverse ecosystem and it's wiping that out. So we can do a monoculture. Mono means one. And so let's say that I'm like, I want to go into the pineapple business, and I go and I buy a bunch of rainforests down in South America, and I cut down and burn my rainforest so that I can plant pineapples. I've gone from having a really great biodiverse amount of species, not only plants, but other organisms, and now I've made it really just one kind of species that grows there. What that does is, by getting rid of that biodiversity of the rainforest, is we're taking so many plants away that take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and use it to make food and oxygen, and we're limiting that now to one. And over the next course of 7 years, because I've only got one species there, we'll talk about soil health. The health of my soil goes way, way down without being a biodiverse ecosystem. And after about maybe like my first couple years, I get tons of pineapples. And then the middle years, I only get like 50% yield. And then by the end of the 7th year, I can't grow anymore. And that soil is totally trashed. And then what do? I take my profits and I buy more rainforests and I cut it down. And so the way that we are managing our, especially food systems, is doing the opposite of allowing plants to help us like fight climate change. It's all about the money, the Benjamins. Plants build soil. We'll look at the structure of plants, not only the top of the plant that we often see with our eyeballs, but underneath there they have root systems that help to hold land together. And it builds the ability of, we talked about the fungi, right? That the fungi can, a big important job of fungi are as one of the decomposer groups, and they take all those nutrients from dead things in the waste and they put the nutrients or the elements back into the ground. And then the plants with their roots, they can absorb some of that. But the roots also make this like stable system that holds on to all of those atoms or elements and makes solid ground. So in areas of the world, like near the oceans, where you have a lot of mangrove trees, and the mangrove trees, they're really good at making these not only overlapping root systems below ground, but above ground. And that helps to stabilize the shores. But we like to not see trees at shorelines. We like beaches where we can do fun things, and it looks prettier to our eye to have a beach. And so when we make beaches, we're often ripping out all of these trees And what the trees do is they stabilize the ground underwater, but also it's kind of interesting, the structure of mangrove trees is that they grow like this above the ground. And when waves come from things like hurricanes and big storms, is this kind of overlapping of their root system above ground as well as below ground, it is a barrier that slows down these waves. Whereas sand, there's nothing to stop big surges of storms to go further and further into land. So where we have ripped down mangroves and made pretty beaches, we have actually like destroyed the ability of storms to be like subsided. We've actually made them just like, come on, welcome, come here. Destroy the rest of the land behind the beach area. So this is really important that plants building and holding on to soil gives us a lot of stability in our land sources. Plants have an enormous effect on the atmosphere and the climate itself. So let's go back to my pineapple farm and the rainforest that used to exist there. In areas that there are rainforests, what happens is the way that plants actually absorb water, and then I think this is so wild, that plants underneath the ground, so in here, the roots are what absorbs water. And so if you think about a rainforest, you've got tons and tons and tons of plants, right? Lots of forests, lots of plants underneath the forest, and they're absorbing water from the soil. When a plant needs more water, when a plant starts to get dehydrated, it has to send the water all the way up to the top of the plant. And on the undersurface of the leaves, there are these pores that open up. And because of water and its ability to stick to itself through hydrogen bonding, it makes these pretty strong chains so that when the pores up here open and they release water, it pulls more water through the plant. So it's, I think, so interesting that when a plant is dehydrated, the mechanism to rehydrate is actually to initially lose some water. The loss of water in plants, it goes into the atmosphere. So those little bits of water that they leave or release when they're dehydrated go into the atmosphere. That's why it's called a rainforest, because there's often, in a rainforest area, there's often rain periodically every day, because all the plants that live there, that biodiversity of plants, they're letting go of water into the atmosphere, and when that builds up, you get clouds and it rains. And then the rain that comes down, the plants are going to grab up again and release, and so then you have these evaporation and precipitation cycles that are really regular in those areas. Now let's go back to my pineapple farm. Sorry, I said we'll go back to it and then I went forward. So where I make all of my pineapples, let's say that I have 100 acres that I get rid of the biodiversity of the plants. What I've done is I've gotten rid of the biodiversity of all of those plants to release water into the atmosphere and make for regular precipitation and evaporation cycles. So where my pineapples are, because I don't have as many plants there, I don't have as much evaporation happening, and I don't have as much precipitation happening. So what I've done by getting rid of or clearing that rainforest, I've changed the climate myself. I have made for less rain cycles to happen. And that not only has an effect on my plants, but neighboring rainforests that might rely on some of that evaporation and precipitation to be healthy. They all kind of like rely on one another, or other ecosystems that are near the rainforest. Now they've become drier and drier and drier over time. And by me planting my pineapples, I have caused droughts in a lot of the ecosystems around me. And then I have enhanced climate change. I have changed the climate myself. All right, so plants, and one thing is that if I cause droughts to happen and my land is dry, like that awful tragedy that happened in Texas this summer, that there was a massive flood, and because the land over time got so incredibly dry, it caused that water to move like a wall, like really, really quickly. And that dry land caused a lot of people, a lot of kids at camp to die. And so now, like, those chain effects of me planting my pineapples by getting rid of the rainforest have caused a change in climate immediately, but also the ecosystems around us. And what we're realizing, well, what we should be realizing, I think we realize it as humans, but we don't do anything to change it, is that by allowing for people like me with a lot of money to come in and do a monoculture, I am literally affecting human life. That the mismanagement of land in Texas led to the deaths of people. And our government just goes, oh, I'm not gonna get into it. I will move on. Okay, so a lot of stuff that's around us comes from plants. Your desk, your walls, our houses, some of our fuel. There is so much medicine, a lot of medicines, no, but some medicines come from plants. So a lot of what we use to have the necessities and the luxuries of life come from plants. If you're somebody who's interested in the medical fields and you're like, you know, I always thought it was like be a doctor. There's so much more that you can do biomedically. If you're somebody who really likes research and working in a lab, or you'd like to maybe go to a rainforest and try and find certain kinds of medicinal properties in plants or fungus or even, you know, other species that are out there, there's a lot of interesting things that are going on. So for example, some discoveries that are made, like aspirin, a simple little aspirin. Aspirin's super important to a lot of people to thin their blood so that they don't get blood clots. Especially for like a lot of elderly people. Really important, take like one baby aspirin a day. Helps them to lower their risk of having a blood clot and thus having a stroke. That was discovered in plant. Malaria drugs to prevent malaria in people. And then painkillers like morphine and codeine. Fungus especially, as I mentioned before, not only are they helping mental health issues, there's a lot of research going on, but also there's issues of toxins that fungus produce or plants produce can actually be healthier, less addictive painkillers than things like morphine, codeine, and some of the other real serious ones that are out right now. Plants have vascular tissues, they have veins like you and I. We are going to take a look at vein or vascular tissue patterns to help identify plants today. So let's talk, I'm going to do a real quick talk about the plants since we're kind of captive here. So we're going to look at a lot of different kinds of plants. We'll also look at a couple of other species as well. When we look at what we call the vascular plants are plants that have veins. The vast majority of plants actually do have a vascular system. And then occasionally we'll have plants that are just small, like moss, for example, that the moss are a really small plant that they never evolved the need for a vascular system. All right, so let's take a look at one. We're going to start out with our non-vascular plant, which are called bryophyta. So this here, our little plant, not these little grasses, there are a few grasses that are growing in our moss here. But this is a little plant, it's short, it almost looks like green carpeting. It likes, you can see a little bit of water in there, it likes to live in a very moist environment. So you'll often see mosses that are growing like underneath the leaf canopy in forests. You'll find these on like shaded areas. So that's moss. That's what our bryophyta looks like. There's other species of bryophyta that look maybe just like a little bit different, but they are very, very small. They are a plant. They are a plantae, and then their phylum group is Bryophyta. Pteridophyta are the ferns. So here I've got a fern. Ferns have a number of new unique characteristics. Some of the characteristics that make ferns obvious are that they, when their leaves grow, they start out rolled up. So like this here is going to start out at what is called a fiddlehead. You can see them, they start out really, really tight, and then they start to unroll. So this one I don't see any fiddleheads, but you may see fiddleheads on ferns. The other thing that you may see is that they have root systems that come out like this. I like to say this one doesn't have it, but they look like hairy, almost like spider legs, but this is part of their root system. Ferns, you can see up at the top there, they make spores to disperse their gametes. To disperse themselves, I should say. So you can see sometimes on the undersurface of the leaves of ferns, you'll see little dots. Some of these characteristics, like for example, we're not always going to see them. So the other thing that we want to look at in terms of ferns is that ferns have what are called fronds. We refer to this whole, like you might want to say this is a whole leaf, but it's actually not an individual leaf. This is a frond, and it has what we call pinnate leaves. So each, like this leaf, which is called a frond, has a lot of what we call pinnate leaves on it. So each of these is a leaf. And then sometimes even the pinnate leaves have pinnate leaves on them. So you have a lot of little like leaves, a leaf, and then tinier leaves and tinier leaves. Sometimes the fronds are really, really big themselves. The gymnosperms. So these are what we would call our evergreen trees because they stay evergreen throughout the year. Like our trees here are deciduous trees, they do not stay green all year, right? They change color and they drop their leaves. They don't drop their leaves all year. So they have needle-like leaves. And what do you mean needle-like? They're like skinny like needles. They often are stronger like needles, and they have pointy ends. They also produce their seeds in pine cones. This is the pine group, or the evergreen trees. The evergreens are found all over the world. They're not just found in cold climates. This is often a misconception. But you do see a lot of pines. Like we went to Florida, and there's tons of different tropical pines there. Tropical pines all over the world, so they don't just look like the stereotypical Christmas tree. They're very, very, very diverse, and they can look like trees that we have here, but the leaves don't drop. And then you have the angiosperms, the flowering plants. So a lot of what I have on this cart are flowering. Flowering plants don't always keep their flowers. The angiosperms are very, very diverse. Angiosperms can be really, really small, like millimeters big, and then they can be like hundreds of meters tall. So we have a great diversity. We have a great diversity in what the flowers look like. Not just all flowers are like this, but grasses can have flowers that just look like little weird, like landmines. They almost look like little bombs that they form. So this is a flowering plant, just like this is a flowering plant.